I experienced the most intense romance of my life. And then I realized he wasn't human. He arrived in the way lovers sometimes do, with attention directed toward the things I already had. A lamp that had been knocked out of alignment and repaired, a cedar wreath hung on the inside of the front door because I had once mentioned I liked the smell, a thermos with a tight brass lid that fit my hand the way a sentence fits a sentence. The house folded around us like an invitation. Sean moved through it as if he had always known the rooms, setting down a cup, turning a switch, choosing a song for the exact stretch of late light that pooled over the kitchen table. He complimented my books in the right moment, and, in those first months, his charm felt like a kind of mercy. Mercy is a small domestic thing, a kettle boiled for you without asking, socks paired and folded in the drawer you thought of as yours. He brought cedar-smelling bundles tied with twine, and the scent in the hallway became a punctuation mark. The cedar held the possibility of ritual. Inside the house, lamps glowed with the kind of yellow that made faces soft in the way portraits in old rooms are softened, and mirrors were placed in angles that answered the corners of the day. My notebooks sat open on the table. Sean would lift one, glance at my handwriting and say, "This makes you look sturdier," as if to acknowledge an inner scaffolding and make it public. I wrote a ledger on the second night. It felt right to start a list in the ledger because the house had the feel of a ledger itself. Items enumerated, entries balanced, small certainties accounted for. The ledger was a thin leather book I bought from an antiquarian's stall the day before he arrived. I wrote at the end of the entry, "This house is mercy." Ledger. Entry. 1. Cedar wreath, left panel roughly straightened. Lamp by the couch, warm bulb, slight flicker. 11:22 p.m. Thermos, brass lid, matches my grip. If you like slow, uncanny stories, stay with us. The first anomalies were not cinematic. They were the kind of misalignments you might excuse to fatigue, or to the small inexactnesses of close living. A photograph on the mantel, a candid from our first trip to the reservoir, had a smudge in the corner that would not come away. I traced it with the pad of my thumb. It felt like residue under skin, cool and slightly granular, and when I breathed in the cedar lodged in the air, the smudge seemed to deepen, as if scent had weight. I began to notice the cameras. Sean had installed a few devices. Sleek, almost invisible white frames, where a decorative piece might have been. Small black lenses tucked into the ceiling like moths. At parties he would stand light-heartedly beneath them and say, "Smile for posterity," and the guests obliged, because Sean made posterity feel like a compliment. He organized dinners where light fell on faces exactly right, and listeners leaned in as if he were performing a rare confection of generosity and modesty. Behind his smile, there was the habit of arranging attention, a maneuver so practiced it passed for warmth. When something unsettled happened, the lamp that flickered in a sequence that wasn't electrical, the photograph smudge, the way the cedar intensified like a punctuation. I did the thing I always do. I named it in ink. I wrote entries that read like evidence and like prayer. Ledger. Entry 7. Photograph, mantle. Smudge resists cleaning. Camera frames installed, white frames. Locations noted, kitchen left corner, hallway above the stairs, living room ceiling center. Ledger, entry 9, scent, cedar stronger after midnight, not continuous. Noted 1:12 a.m., 3:04 a.m. I asked Kem first. He knows cameras the way some people know faces. We had met during a siding installation for a neighbor 3 years earlier. He is practical in the way that calms a noise. Kem came with a toolkit and a frown that softened as soon as he saw the ledger. "Let's see what the metadata says," he said, not unkindly. I handed him a flash drive with exported files. He squinted at my laptop, thumbed through timestamps, explained how codecs work, how a file could go corrupt, how white frames could be the result of an overexposed sensor. He was calm in a way that encouraged a belief in a solution. We tested. Kem set up 3 redundant cameras, one high-res mirrorless on the bookshelf, a continuous recorder tucked behind a curtain, and a wired device he insisted on, because wired is better than wireless for one small reason. It resists the strange things that happen when signals fold. We waited. Sean orchestrated a small dinner party that same week, the kind of event where his charm amortized whatever misgivings anyone might have. Friends arrived wearing shoes polished by curiosity. Sean stood in the doorway and made an announcement as if introducing a play. The cameras all pointed politely at the table. At 10:07 p.m., the moment I had hoped would prove me wrong occurred. Someone at the table reached across to take a dish, a laugh that was not mine in my ear, and the files we had relied on should be a record of ordinary motion. Faces, hands, reflections. We watched the footage together, Kem shoulder to shoulder, Sean quietly luminous in the background pretending to be interested in his own anecdote. The frame went white at the exact second of the reach. For 2 long seconds the image became blank and glowing, like a sheet held up to the light, and then returned as if nothing had happened. The timestamp where the blank had been read, 10:07:12. Kem set the camera down on the counter. He opened the file's metadata, scrolled, and closed it as if he were handling something fragile and alive. No visible anomaly in the sensor data, he said. No overexposure logged. There's no electrical spike on the line either. He touched the laptop's cold metal surface. But the frame was white. That's not software corruption unless something very particular happened. I remember thinking the word particular, as if it were a small animal. Sean smiled and reached across the table and made a joke about undoing the mystery. His ability to make questions feel like amusements was inexhaustible. It was the charm again. He could cloak bafflement in the architecture of laughter. Journal entry, 23. Dinner party. Redundant cameras. Frame blanked 10:07:12. No electrical spike documented. Sean put his hand on my back in a way that was almost comforting, and almost as if he were setting the book of me on the right shelf. Later, alone, I stood in the hallway and sniffed. The cedar was dense enough to make the bones in my nose feel lined. I wrote that down in the ledger. Cedar dense after large gatherings. Ledger. Entry 24. Cedar intensifies after social events. Possible correlation noted. It is a strange thing to watch a man who is beloved by a crowd remain private in the same breath. Sean gave the right gifts, knew what to say to the person serving canapés, remembered names and the uncommon preferences on platters. The applause he received was not loud but comprehensive. Neighbors who had never said more than a hi would remark on his taste in linens. In public, he was an economy of gestures that left people feeling better about themselves. In private, he did not explain the white frames. He did not ask. He would pick up my ledger and flip its pages, making a face that suggested he was amused by my compulsions. "You're cataloging ghosts," he said once, a tilt to his words that made them sound like a compliment. "That's very romantic, Ivy." Romance in that line felt like a theft, as if my attention, my meticulous attention, was being appropriated into a performance. Attention is an armor I wear. I had built the ledger as a way to turn attention into fact. I had always believed records held a kind of authority. You write down a thing, and it grows less like a dream and more like an object you could carry. I began small rituals. Lamps were repositioned to the degree. Quarter turns that seemed absurd when explained, but not absurd when enacted every evening. Mirrors angled so that the space under the couch, where the earliest hints of movement seemed to gather, would be triangulated by reflected sight. A cedar box, small and lacquered, found its place in a shallow drawer and became a repository for tokens that felt like evidence. A single button from a cardigan I was sure I had not lost, a faint smudge of something on a scrap of paper, a hair that did not match anyone's in the house. I kept the key to that drawer in my pocket like a small, secret faith. Ledger. Entry. 31. Mirrors repositioned. 3 points of view on under couch area. Cedar box acquired. Contents. Button, scrap, hair strand. I did not tell Sean where the cedar box was. He asked about the ledger once, and I gave him a short, true answer. It's how I keep myself. He accepted this with the same easy acquiescence he offered to all my domestic particularities. He did not pry. He did not need to. The tactile encounters began as small and almost polite things. A fingertip that brushed my own in the dark under the sofa. Or perhaps it was my thought that brushed dust. One evening I dropped a paperclip near the couch and reached under for it. My hand encountered a coolness that was not human heat. It was a marble coolness, a sensation like a stone rinsed in river water and held against skin. The contact was brief. I withdrew my hand with the reflex of someone who has learned boundaries without having named them. I wrote it down immediately. Ledger. Entry 38. First contact, fingertip. Cool, marble-like. Cedar intensifies. Time noted 11:23 p.m. I remember the way my skin kept that outline of cold, as if the sensation had printed itself there. I also remember in the ledger that the entry is a way to make a thing shareable even when I do not share it. The ledger is what I can pass to a friend and say, "See this," and tell me it is nonsense. It does not work like that. The ledger is a private tribunal. Kem was the one I trusted to test without moral theater. He came over one rainy Wednesday with a backpack of devices and a posture that meant science but also meant friend. We set the cameras again, one on a tripod with a manual override and constant aperture, one on continuous infrared, another hidden in a framed print that we both pretended to hang for looks. We put a watch on the coffee table. A little analog thing ticked in place as a witness. We sipped coffee and let the house do the rest, and for hours nothing happened except for the ordinary. The house cooperated with ordinariness, like a thing that wants to be known for civility. Late, as the storm leaned into the windows, I sat with a blanket over my knees and the ledger open. It had become in these weeks a palimpsest. Crossed-out lines, arrows that pointed like underlining. I had started numbering in the margins, as if each anomaly deserved a docket. "You're patient," Kem said, reading the ledger over my shoulder like a priest reading a list of sins. "Most people would have driven to the precinct or done a TV interview. You document." "I don't want spectacle," I said. "If there's something wrong, I want to be able to understand it. If it's nothing," I tapped the page with a fingernail, "then I'll have a reasonable place from which to move on." He nodded. He said, "Reasonable is underrated, and yet, a rational path was not the same as a convincing one." The house kept giving me the small whispers. Cedar in the hallway that seemed to pulse. A smear that softened when I tried to wipe it, and then returned like a tide. The cameras did exactly what the cameras were told to do. They recorded only to misplace the crucial moment in white. Wherever the presence chose to be, its rule included the blanking of light at the sight of a lens trained on it. One afternoon I arrived home from a day at the library with a new journal in my tote, and found Sean hosting an informal photo session for a local magazine. He had coaxed a photographer to come by under the pretense of a profile on local tastemakers. There was a small crowd, and Sean thrived in the arrangement. He poured wine, guided conversation, diffused awkwardness with self-deprecating humor, and at the same time he positioned the people so that the lens had to look at the room in a particular way. The photographer, a vexed sort with a quick eye, complimented the lamps and the curtains, and then asked if he might take a picture of the two of us near the mantel. We agreed. I felt absurd at the staging. I felt also something like gratitude that I could lean into the performance. The flash popped, and the image would have been perfect. The mantel with its slight smudge, Sean's hand on my shoulder like an artful punctuation, the cedar wreath slightly shadowed. When the photographer showed me the preview on his camera screen, the image had a white pocket where, in the instant of the shutter, something had obliterated part of the frame. He frowned and tried again. He checked his settings. He stamped his foot into the ground and whispered to his assistant. The flash went off again. The same white pocket. He apologized and offered to recompose the shot, to try another angle. I felt my cheeks warm. Under the double pressures of being made visible, and being disbelieved by the very tools we had thought would testify to reality. Sean smiled, and said it was a technical issue, and made a joke about the house having its own ideas. The photographer laughed, shrugged his shoulders, and moved on to a still life of the thermos on the kitchen table. The thermos always photographed well. Ledger, entry 47. Photographer, white pocket in 2 consecutive shots. Sean laughing. Public explanation, technical issue. There is a moral economy to charm. When a person is liked enough, the public prefers to fold anomalies into kindness. People who adored Sean construed the blanks as atmospheric, artistic. They preferred a narrative where an artist's house breathes and hiccups rather than one in which there is some inconvenient truth that requires confrontation. In that economy, the ledger I kept was a counter-currency, meticulous, less flashy, ill-equipped to buy applause. My mother called one afternoon, and her voice cut through the ledger's quiet as if it were a bell. She has always been brisk with worry and practical favors. "Are you safe?" she asked. She did not mince the question like a headline. Her voice landed the way weather does, plain and unavoidable. "I think so," I said. "I have the ledger." "Good," she said. "Make a plan. Don't make it a story." There was a bluntness to her that had always been steady. If someone else would help, ask. Don't be ashamed. I did not tell her what the ledger called presence. I told her I had anomalies. Her lightness after I told her, the way she suggested we come by with an overnight bag if needed, made a shield of mundane care. Mother's care is the kind that constructs exits as if they were domestic fixtures. She wanted to make sure I had keys, money in a drawer, a cab number and a contact list. I started sleeping with the cedar box under the pillow. It is ridiculous to confess that here. It felt ridiculous at the time. But the box was small, and the smell of cedar at night consoled me like a practiced word. I began to pay attention to the sequence by which the cedar strengthened. A quiet ring around midnight, and then a fuller concentration after the house had had guests. I placed a small lamp under the couch, an act that read as both surveillance and superstition, and angled the lamp so the edges of the sofa cast a particular shadow. One night I had the ledger on my lap and the lamp at the exact angle I had instructed it to be for weeks. I had a watch beside me, ticking with the kind of clarity that seems to be a rebuke to superstition. I kept one hand on the ledger and one hand on the lamp's base as a ritual of steadiness. It was nearly 3 a.m, and rain drummed the windows a soft, precise note. From beneath the couch came the smallest movement, a suggestion of motion, as if the house were breathing in an odd new rhythm. I eased my hand toward the couch, not because I expected to find anything that would satisfy the world, but because I wanted to know what it felt like to meet it with my eyes open. My hand moved with the deliberate slowness of someone conducting a fragile experiment. Fingers extended into the narrow shadow were a way to create proof for myself, even without a camera to record it. My fingertip met coolness. It was not a touch like another person pressing for contact. It was a contact that acknowledged and then withdrew, like a cat tasting air and deciding a moment later to be elsewhere. The sensation was marble cool as before, and edged with something that might have been a faint iridescence. The sense of a surface that refused to be categorized as skin, but was capable of leaving the record of touch. At the instant of contact, the cedar scent sharpened as if someone had opened a drawer full of shaved wood. For a blink, my hands were connected to something that had its own logic of pressure and pull. I did exactly what the ledger expects of me. I did not scream, I did not call anyone, I recorded. I set the watch aside and wrote, "Ledger, entry 52, under couch contact, fingertip, marble cool iridescent suggestion, cedar spike at contact, time 2:52 a.m. It is possible to recount that moment without theatrics, because the feeling of a fingertip meeting something different is not dramatic in the sense of explosions or screams. It is simply precise and anatomically discomfiting. It rearranged me the way an incorrect sentence rearranges the rhythm of a paragraph. There was curiosity in the way it touched, exploratory without impudence, and I measured that with a calm I do not often feel. I think I wanted to know what could be learned from a brief contact. I moved then into a practice of attention that was equal parts science and ritual. I put a small sheet over the lamp and marked the angles with bits of tape. I kept a thermos of coffee within reach because alertness seems to be a necessary ingredient in observational work. I set up an additional camera with a manual shutter and a pair of gloves against the couch arm. I did not wake Sean. He was not sleeping at the time, but he did not need to be awake for the house to be as it was. In the mornings, Sean would string together what had happened into an anecdote that made sense to him and to everyone who shared a social life with him. He told stories about the photographer and the white pockets and made them into jokes, the kind of jokes that convert bewilderment into amiability. He never mentioned the ledger, and he never asked to see it. He knows the ledger is mine. There is a peculiar loneliness that arrives when the social world prefers the agreeable narrative. People told me that the blank frames could be attributed to equipment flaws. They offered suggestions that were both compassionate and dismissive. There is an unspoken contract that extends in the direction of preserving someone's reputation when they give so freely of their geniality. Sean had, without malice I think, accumulated a kind of goodwill that insulated him from the kind of public skepticism that would have otherwise demanded explanation. The ledger recorded this, in less graceful language than I might wish, as a kind of social friction. Ledger. Entry 59. Community reaction. Defect explanations offered. Sean's social capital deflects suspicion. What kept the ledger from feeling like a frantic catalog was the way I began to practice gentleness with myself. I allowed for doubt. I allowed for the possibility that in time these things would dissipate or that we would find a benign explanation. But the ledger also taught me patience. Each entry was a way to delay the pressure to perform the moment into a sensational story. I am not a private person insofar as I have no need to be seen. I am private because public spectacle takes something with it that cannot be retrieved. Kem suggested we install an analog camera that recorded on film as a kind of homage to a stubbornness I admired. Film doesn't do the white pocket, he said, because he believed somehow in the particularity of an older machine's refusal to collude with whatever current caused the white frames. He ordered one online and wrapped it in bubble wrap like something sacred. It arrived in a courier's box that smelled faintly of glue. We carried it into the living room like two people bearing a relic. When we set it up, the old mechanism clicked in a tactile way that made us both smile with a shared memory of reliability. We ran film and left it to develop the way you leave dough to rest. When Kem brought the developed strips to my hands, I examined them as if they were pages of scripture. Most frames were ordinary, grains of a life that moves, the thermos on the table, the lamp's cone, a shoe half entering the scene. But at 2:52 a.m. on the strip, there was a moment where a strip of white grazed the edge like a contamination. The film had reacted in a way that was different from the digital file, but still not an adherent proof. The white did not articulate into a shape. It was a smear of luminosity. Kem folded his hands and said, "This is not an accident." His voice had a softness that suggested he was saying something fragile. But it's also not proof in the sense that people will accept. It's a record of interference. He tapped the ledger and flipped pages as if confirming that I had been right to document. I am not immune to wanting the world to know. I told myself, often, that I did not need vindication. What I needed was safety. But there were nights when the ledger felt like a cold comfort, and I entertained the idea of a press conference. I considered, with a horror at my own longing for spectacle, the possibility of forcing the issue into light. I did not proceed with the press conference. Instead, I adjusted my life. I did things that were small but decisive. I numbered spare keys, I arranged for a friend to call me at regular intervals without false alarms, and I bought a second thermos and kept it in a bag packed by the front door. I learned to move quietly through rooms as if I were walking on a floor that might shift at the press of a toe. Sean continued to be wonderful in public. He continued to make the city corridors his stage. He would come home late from openings and tell me small stories about donations and designs. He would pinch the bridge of my nose with a finger as if to say, "We will laugh about this later." In the ledger I wrote with a strange tenderness of his charm as a weapon and a consolation. Ledger. Entry 72. Sean's public persona persists. Private friction remains. My choices lean toward survival. There is a chapter of the ledger I rarely read aloud. It holds memories of the earliest weeks of our romance. The way his hand felt against the small of my back on a damp evening. The way he learned the names of my father's books. How he mended a tear in a curtain with such a slow, exact tenderness that it made me trust him. Those memories did not contradict the ledger's entries about white frames and marble-cool fingers. They made the ledger painful because the affection I felt was not to be dismissed. We share more than the house's floorboards. We had once shared a kind of mutual curiosity that had felt like light. The thing about slow, uncanny relationships is that they ask you to hold tenderness and wariness simultaneously. I could not, in honest good faith, deny the good things. Nor could I absolve myself of the duty to keep watch. Each night I checked the angles of the lamps as if adjusting them would protect something inside me that was tender and stubborn. One night, not long after the film strip returned with its smudge of white, I decided I would try to touch again. Not with the reckless curiosity of someone seeking spectacle, but with a controlled experiment. The ledger was on the table with a pen set in the margin. I placed a small LED lamp under the couch and watched the way its light turned the underside of the sofa into a low horizon. I set my watch. I drew a line in the ledger and wrote a time. Ledger. Entry 83. Planned contact. Lamp angle set. Gloves prepared. Film camera loaded. I removed one glove and extended my hand slowly into the shadow. The room smelled of cedar and rain. My fingertip met the coolness, and for a fraction of a second, something pressed back. A pressure that was uninterested in recognition and yet precise. It did not belong to a human pattern of touch. It was a touch that measured rather than claimed. At that moment the lamp's cone faltered. Not a white pocket as on film, but a subtle failing. A blink. A minute slackening of light that was like a second of an eye closing. My hand tightened on the glove, and I did not pull away immediately. I wanted to know how far that press would go. In that quiet, something moved apart from me, and the ledger remembers. The cedar grew with suddenness. My watch recorded 2:56 a.m. and kept clicking. The lamp steadied as if nothing had happened. But the knowledge of that interruption remained lodged in me like a grain of sand. I was not afraid in the way one is in a movie. I was, rather, alert in a way I have always believed vigilance can be a kind of love for oneself. I withdrew my hand and closed the ledger. I smelled cedar on my fingers as if it had been shepherded there. I cleaned my hand carefully and put the glove back into the drawer where it belonged. I did not tell Sean. I put the film strip into an envelope and slid it into the cedar box. I stood in the hallway and looked at the lamps set like faithful sentries. The house hummed with ordinary appliances in the rain. I thought of the thread that runs between choice and compulsion, the way a person decides to leave or to stay. My ledger is full of small lines that read like exits. The telephone numbers, the cabin keys, the times a taxi was requested. They are practical. They are possible. They are not decisions made for me. In the slow hours before dawn, I packed a small bag. I put in a thermos, a spare pair of shoes, the ledger, the cedar box, and a few folded shirts. I did not pack as if I were fleeing. I packed as if I were taking what I needed to continue living in the world on my terms. Packing felt like setting a sentence into motion. It was not dramatic. It was deliberate. I did not leave that morning. I left in the hour before afternoon, when shadows have a softened patience. I walked through rooms with the lamp angles held as if in place by a promise. I paused in the doorway and set the cedar box on the mantel, more to remember where I had kept it than to leave it as a trap. Then I moved toward the back door with the small bag, at once small and absurdly final. When I closed the door behind me, the cedar in the hall was a warm cloak. The smell followed me onto the steps like a memory that could not be contained. I walked down the block toward the corner where a small bed above a bookshop had come open in a listing a friend had forwarded. It was not a home in any grand sense, but it was a room and a bookshop downstairs, and the thought of a smaller, quieter arrangement felt like a possible form of life. I did not march away in triumph. I did not file a complaint that would rip the room open for cameras and talk shows. I carried my ledger like a passenger, and the cedar box with the careful reverence of a private thing. The city folded and unrolled with the usual indifference. People passed me on their way to appointments. Sean's life in public did not blanch for the absence of my figure. It continued on the same polished rails of gatherings and curated smiles. I found the room above the bookshop dark and quiet and full of the smell of printed paper and coffee. I set down my bag and opened the ledger. There is a comfort in recording in a place that is itself an archive of collected things. The bookshop downstairs closed early, but the owner had left a light on for me. I placed the cedar box on the nightstand and inhaled. Ledger, entry 94. Moved to room above bookshop, temporary. Cedar box beside bed. Lamps later. I sat on the edge of the bed and wrote until the page had more ink than sense. I wrote about the way Sean arranged attention, about how cameras had failed, about the cool fingertip, about the cedar. I wrote about how leaving felt like not a ruin but a realignment of priorities. That dignity is not proof but practice. Outside, the city kept its own rhythm of ordinariness. I could not know whether leaving would change anything for Sean or for the presence. What I knew was more modest and more precise. I had taken measures. I had used attention as armor and the ledger as a map. I had not sought spectacle. I had sought steadiness. The cedar scent lingered on my hands from the box. I closed the ledger and listened to the bookshop's street lamp hum. There are chapters yet unwritten, the way Kem will insist on new tests, the way my mother will come and hand me a sweater and ask if I am eating, the way Sean will continue to charm rooms and perhaps never ask me why I left. There will be further contacts and perhaps more white pockets. There will be nights when I will be tempted to show the world everything in the ledger, and nights when my hands will shake at the sight of the small cedar box. I slept that night with the cedar under my pillow and the ledger on the nightstand. My last entry before rest was a line that tried to make peace with an unromantic conclusion. Ledger. Entry 101. Left quietly. Survival prioritized. Evidence retained. He wasn't human. I woke to light filtered through pages of a window poster downstairs, and I felt, for the first morning in a long time, a kind of silence that was not the erasure of worry, but its temporary reprieve. The cedar was a watermark on the waking. I made coffee in a kettle borrowed from the shop owner, and wrapped my hands around the thermos with its brass lid the way one holds a small, trusted thing. I don't know yet what the ledger will become. I do not hesitate to say that the romance I had was intense in ways that changed the topology of my life. The intensity was not simply in the giving of gifts or the timing of shows. It was in the way his presence made the world hinge, and in the way the house seemed to keep certain secrets even as it staged hospitality. I have left to preserve something quieter. My capacity to be watched without being consumed. There are more tests to arrange, more angles to mark with tape, more cameras to set and watch. Kem will call, and he will be practical and tender, and my mother will arrive with a bag of things, and the kind of scolding that is also love. There are choices ahead that will require me to be precise. Whether to publish the ledger, whether to open up the cedar box to a stranger's gaze, whether to try for proof in a forum that prefers spectacle over nuance. For now I have chosen the small dignity of packing a thermos and a notebook, and the cedar box for a pillow. Standing at the window, I wrote one more short line in the ledger, not a proof, but a fact that belonged to me. Ledger. Entry 107. He chose pleasure over reality. He wasn't human. I set the pen down and watched the light on the pages. There was a pause in the world, as if someone had turned a lamp down by a fraction. The house I had left was somewhere behind me, its lamps still set in the angles Sean preferred. The bookshop's bell chimed when a customer came in, and the smell of paper rose like an insistence on ordinary things. I made myself a list of small tasks. Call Kem, call Mother, position lamps in the new room, buy a notebook for the shop, mark camera angles. I would not seek to make the private public if public only meant spectacle. But I would not be passive either. The ledger would remain my record and my prayer. The cedar box would be a weight I could hold when the doubt wavered. Outside, cars threaded past, and a pair of teenagers laughed at the corner as if the city were only a comedy. Inside my new room, the lamps threw long, courteous light. I poured coffee into the thermos and tucked the ledger into my bag, watching the cover like a promise. The cedar clung to my fingers as a watermark. And for that day at least, the thing that had been the most intense romance of my life sat folded into the pages of a book and the brass of a thermos, like a secret that had been turned into a way to live. I did not expect a resolution. I expected the slow accumulation of days where attention would either harden into proof or soften into an explanation I could live with. What I did expect, with a stubborn steadiness, was to keep recording. The ledger is not a weapon. It is a means of staying present. It is how I stay with what happened without becoming the spectacle it might have demanded. There will be more nights, more touches perhaps, more moments where the cameras blink and the cedar swells. But I have learned the cost of public vindication. Sometimes it takes away more than it gives. I turned out the lamp, and for a moment the cedar was my only company. The pages of the ledger held ink like a constellation. I slept with the thermos at the bedside, and the cedar box under the pillow, and I dreamed of light aligned to a sentence's rhythm. The morning after I moved, the bookshop below left a card tucked under my door. Welcome to the room above. It was printed in a careful serif, a small rectangle of civility. I kept the card in the ledger for a week until the edges softened from being turned over. There is a particular satisfaction in small certainties. A card that names you, a shop owner who leaves the light on, a thermos you trust, time lengthened like a margin in that new place. Days arranged themselves around errands and the quiet architecture of routines. I learned the angles of the new lamp immediately, how the shade softened light across the narrow bed, where shadow pooled so that I could imagine the underside of things without needing to know them. I made a map of the little room on a fresh page: lamp position, nightstand, cedar box, Window latch. Maps are another kind of ledger. They make allowances for the space a person will inhabit. Ledger. Entry 108. Room above bookshop. Lamp position established. Light soft to the left. Window latch checked. The owner downstairs was Mr. Kaplan, a man who moved like a sentence written in full, polite cadence. He liked to talk about bindings. Books are the only things that can be mended properly, he told me on my second day, handing me a mug of black coffee. He would come up sometimes in the afternoons, 2 cups in hand, to ask if I needed anything. Ink, a small lamp bulb, or someone to listen to whether the bookshop's bell sounded different lately. His presence was ordinary and reliable. It felt possible to sleep with the cedar box beside my head, with Mr. Kaplan's hum of small kindness below. Kem took longer to arrive than I expected. He had been useful in the old house in practical ways, capable hands and neat observations. But he was also the friend who treated the ledger with the same respect he would give a project plan. When he came up the stairs, rain still clinging to his jacket, he carried a duffel bag full of careful instruments and an expression that signaled both curiosity and a kind of worry without melodrama. He sat on the edge of my bed and turned a page in the ledger with the same steadiness he brought to a solder joint. "We could try different frequencies," he said, as if naming a menu. "Thermal, ultrasound, different shutters, redundancies upon redundancies." I nodded. "I want to know the rules," I said. "Not necessarily to expose it, but to understand how to live around it." He smiled as if the sentence pleased him. "Understanding is the practical thing. We ran experiments that were smaller than the dramas the mind can imagine. Thermographic cameras showed temperature gradients and nothing else unusual. Warm spots where a kettle had been set down, the faint cool of a window pane. Ultrasound returned static. We compared logs, annotated timestamps, cross-checked power surges with the local grid's public feed. On a rainy Tuesday, a technician from the grid office called to say there had been no abnormalities relevant to our timestamps. It was a kind of vindication because it told us that the blank frames were not simple electrical flukes. It was frustrating because it also told us how stubbornly the phenomenon wished to be unread. Ledger. Entry 115. Thermal and ultrasound tests. No explanatory signature. Grid check negative. Rules remain partial. Over the next months, small things kept knitting themselves into the fabric of my days. I catalogued mail. I learned to make a decent pot of coffee on a stovetop. I returned library books on time. The ledger's pages filled with tiny domestic notations. Book titles reshelved, a lamp bulb replaced, a neighbor's dog barking at 6:12 a.m., and with the necessary repetitions of the anomalies, cedar spikes on certain nights, photographs that blurred in ways that suggested a pocket of light, frames that whitened despite our precautions. Sometimes the world outside my room threaded into this quieter life in ways that made the ledger feel like a private weather report while a storm passed beyond. Sean's name traveled the city's orbit as if it were a currency. He was reviewed in columns, photographed shaking hands with donors, caught smiling beneath spots of media light. I would see his face in a glossy magazine at the shop, posed in profiles where everything about him looked calibrated to be liked. There is a surrealness to seeing a person you know reduced to a portrait that offers no fissures. The cedar aroma clung to those images in my imagination like a watermark. I would close the magazine and run a finger along the edge. On the occasions when I bumped into him in the city, at an exhibition, once slipping past each other in a gallery corridor, he greeted me with the same generosity that had folded the house when he first arrived. He told me, with the ease of someone reciting something practiced, that he had been meaning to come by. His voice was pleasant in the way that made apologies feel like small ceremonies of taste. "I've been swamped," he said. "Shows, donors, the city's little drives." He laughed and added, "You always make everything sound like a project, Ivy." The ledger, I would later note, contains a contrary affection for that laugh. It records the way it could be balm and a veil at once. I listened to him and kept my smile measured. It is easy to imagine a different scene, a confrontation, a demand that he explain. Those scenes hum like possibilities, but I had learned that spectacle could take from you the very thing you hoped to defend. Instead, I returned to the desk in the room above the bookshop and wrote down the encounter. Ledger, entry 128. Saw Sean at gallery. Polite exchange. Public persona intact. No further conversation. My mother visited with 2 suitcases and the practical sort of tenderness that comes in ordered casseroles and precise instructions about power of attorney documents. She brought an extra kettle and a small alarm clock she thought would be useful. She refused to stay the night initially. "I'll come in the morning," she said, because she knows the ways people guard their privacy. Yet she sat across from me at the shop's back table and asked pointed questions that were more useful than she let on. "Are you sleeping?" she asked. "Better," I said. "The bookshop's quiet. The lamp is good." "Do you have money?" she asked. "I do." "Then make a plan to change locks when you go back," she said, and I could hear the way she was already unspooling ways of keeping me safe. "Don't trust the man who won't answer. Practice exits." There is a simple bravery in parental bluntness. My mother's presence was a small engineering project of care. She stayed 2 nights, and we measured the room's sounds like a cartographer might map a coastline. We turned the lamp a fraction and watched the way shadow arranged itself. She folded towels into the drawer and left, still scanning the street, still making mental notes. Ledger. Entry. 133. Mother visited. Plans discussed. Locks. Exits. Practical care reinforced. The cedar box remained my talisman. Sometimes I would open it and take out the film strip Kem had given me and hold it up to the lamp, the white smear catching the light, inscrutable and stubborn. Kem would sit with me in the late hours, both of us listening to the soft rustle of pages below, and he would offer hypotheses and confessions of bafflement and the occasional joke that lightened the ledger's gravity. "It's interference of a sort," he said once, running his hand over the film again as if feeling the grain. "It behaves like something that refuses to be read. But it's not indifferent," I would add. "It reacts to attention in consistent ways." "Then attention is its grammar," he replied. "It reads observation and answers with a pause." That phrase stayed with me. Attention is its grammar. It shaped the way I thought about the room, as if the act of looking were a language, and the appendage an interlocutor that responded by withholding. The ledger wrote it down with the simplicity of a definition. Ledger. Entry 141. Observation. Attention as grammar. Presence responds by removal or by altering light. There were moments of quiet temptation. Nights when I considered bringing the ledger to someone in earnest, tempting myself with the idea of a lawyer or a scientist who could name what had happened and thereby make it smaller. Each time, something in my chest resisted. Exposure could bring repair, perhaps, but it would also hand my story to a crowd hungry for spectacle. I had watched Sean feed a public appetite for charm. I had seen how quickly narrative can be bent into applause. I did not want my life to become a platform for someone else's performance. So I arranged myself instead. I taught myself to read the house like a living thing. When cedar deepened, I put the kettle on. When the thermos felt heavy in my bag, I took it as a reminder that heat is a kind of company. I made small rituals of preparedness. Each ritual was a way of transferring the ledger's authority into a set of behaviors. Lamp angles, checked locks, a friend to call at set hours. These practices were not dramatic. They were a refusal to be reduced to a moment. Every few weeks I would go back to the house, ostensibly to collect something I had left behind. A book, an extra thermos, and sometimes to check the ledger's old pages against the present state of the rooms. I did not go to confront. My visits were plain and administrative. Cross-check inventories, take photographs of objects that could be mine, retrieve personal effects. I learned the roots out and practiced them. Each trip was an exercise in the kind of quiet courage the ledger teaches. One evening, on a return meant only to collect an overdue copy of a poetry book, I stayed longer than I intended. The house smelled exactly as it had on the first day. Cedar folded into the halls like a low hymn. I had my thermos in a tote, the ledger folded into a sleeve. Sean was hosting a small group of people, artists and a curator, so the rooms had the same hum of arranged attention. I put on a neutral expression and moved among the edges of the gathering like a polite temperature check. He saw me and raised his glass in a way that was generous and performative both. "Ivy," he said, across a laughing line. "Do sit with us for a moment." I considered the invitation. The ledger sat under my arm like a gentle weight. For a second, my old inclinations, toward explanation, perhaps to demand a conversation where the house would be witness, rose like a tide. Then I remembered the ledger's steadying instruction about dignity and the cost of spectacle. I took my thermos and excused myself politely. I walked toward the back stairs with the casualness of someone retrieving a book. In the hall, I paused and put my hand against the wall as if testing whether the plaster hummed differently. I felt nothing. I listened to the murmur of voices. I thought about the way attention had been the appendage's currency. Public light would be a feast for it. The ledger had taught me that the appendage often answered in the presence of cameras and crowds by blanking the frame. I did not want to be a member of the audience that fed it. I walked out with something like the relief of a practiced decision. Ledger, entry 157, returned for book, stayed in margins of party, avoided feeding spectacle. The presence's ways did not relent. On a night some weeks later, when winter pressed its cold into the pavement and the bookshops smelled of frying onions and old paper, I sat in the little room and felt the ledger's pages gust under my hand as a wind might pass through a curtain. The cedar box was beside me, small and accusingly faithful. I placed a film camera near the window and set a manual shutter with steady hands. If the appendage answered to attention, perhaps the wrong sort of attention would only invite the same blanking. But my experiments were not intended to trap. They were attempts to learn the grammar of presence. At 1:48 a.m. the apartment altered its rhythm. The light in the hallway dimmed fractionally, as if someone had turned a lamp's shade a fraction. The thermos at my feet hummed with the warmth of day-old coffee. I felt a faint pressure at the soles of my feet, an almost imperceptible vibration that ran up through the floorboards like someone tapping Morse code. I moved to the edge of the bed with measured slowness, an action that in itself felt ceremonial, and extended my hand toward the baseboard. My fingertips met wood that trembled with cold. There was that same marble suggestion, a surface not skin, but responding as if spoken to. For a moment the room's cedar intensified, as if someone had opened a drawer full of shaving. I did not want to name it a caress, nor did I want to call it an assault. It was an instance of contact that asked for classification and refused. I did precisely what the ledger and my better judgment had trained me to do. I did not call anyone. I set the film camera to a different setting and adjusted the lamp a quarter turn, noting the numbers in the ledger as if my pen were a scalpel. I let the film roll in for another hour, not out of an expectation of proof but as a catalog of behavior. Ledger, entry 172, floorboard contact. Marble cool, cedar spike, film rerouted and left to roll. It is possible to imagine courage as dramatic and explosive. My kind of courage was quieter, measured in the color of small adjustments. I began to think less in terms of facing a monstrous other than in terms of forming a life around ambiguous presence. I would not be reduced to an example on a talk show. I would not parade the cedar box for strangers. I was protective of my story because the ledger had taught me the economy of attention. Once you hand your narrative to others, they spend what they find on their own gratifications. Kem announced an unconventional idea in late winter, a long-duration time-lapse with redundant analog systems, one that would record weeks rather than single nights. If the phenomenon is about the grammar of attention, he said, laying out a plan on my bedspread, then maybe attention stretched out will coax a pattern. Patterns like that refuse short-term tricks. We set up a row of cameras, analog, digital, thermal, and a spare model that was a retrofitted Polaroid modified to click on a timer. We hid equipment inside books, behind frames, and in lamp bases. We labeled everything with strips of masking tape and the times we expected each to click. It felt like preparing for floodwatch. For 3 weeks, I lived in the new room with taped markers on windowsills and a makeshift chart on the wall where shots showed nothing remarkable and occasional blotches of inconsistency. The white pockets persisted now and then, an imprint on film, a washed-out blank in a digital stop frame. But the long gaze revealed something subtle. Cedar spikes often followed gatherings by roughly the same interval, a kind of delayed response, as if the presence metabolized attention and exhaled scent at a scheduled pace. Ledger. Entry 189. Long-duration observation installed. Pattern. Cedar spike often 3 to 6 hours post-gathering. White pockets persist intermittently. During this period, Sean's name kept surfacing in the paper. A philanthropist praised him. A design column called him an emergent voice with an evident knack for collaborations. The more the public adored him, the less likely anyone was to look for cracks. Applause is an effective blinder. I did not follow the articles closely. I learned to take in his increasing visibility like weather, a condition beyond my control, to be observed but not engaged with. There were nights when, in the half-light of my lamp, I would unpack one memory from the early days. How he had found a small, torn page from an old journal and stitched it back into an otherwise ordinary book. How he had sat with me while I read aloud a paragraph I loved until his voice matched its cadences. Those intimate recollections did not contradict my ledger's evidence about white frames and cool fingertips. Instead, they complicated them. Human beings can have great tenderness and not be what they seem. That thought made leaving both necessary and also mournful. Romance, even when it becomes a lesson about the limits of trust, is still a change in how one will speak to the world thereafter. In late spring, Mr. Kaplan found me a small volunteer shift at the shop, cataloging donations between the stacks. It was the kind of work that allowed me to be present without excess exposure. The shop's rhythm suited me. I made lists of new arrivals. I described bindings precisely. I folded letters into packets. My ledger gained a new column of notations that were life-affirming and mundane. A rare folio donated by a college. A stack of postcards to file. A bookmark pressed into an old novel. Ledger. Entry 196. Volunteer shift begins. Cataloging as presence. Ordinary tasks re-establish equilibrium. On a humid June evening, I received a phone call that made my hands clench around the thermos. It was the neighbor from down the block, breathless and private. "Ivy," she said, "are you seeing what everyone is seeing this week?" I paused. "Who?" "Sean. There's a piece. He's doing something at the Riverwalk. People are talking about cedar themes in his installation. It's odd, Ivy. Are you—" I felt a strange surge. Not fear, exactly, but the rawness of being linked to an image that might carry the cedar into a public spectacle. For a moment I pictured the appendage, if it would consent to be seen, turned into a prop. "I know," I said. "Thank you for telling me." Ledger. Entry 204. Sean's public work incorporates cedar motifs. Neighbor alerted. That installation got more press than anything he had done before. There were photographs of crowds at night, lamps hung like constellations, strands of shaved wood placed in glass cases. People praised the immersive nature of the piece, its tactile references to memory and place. The city loved the conceit. I read reviews in the shop, drank coffee, and watched strangers admire something that had, in intimate moments, mattered to me in a very specific way. A private scent had been adopted into an art form and applauded for its suggestiveness. Charm had transmuted the cedar into a theme everyone could own. I stayed away from the opening. I wrote a short note and left it in the ledger instead. "Art makers borrow languages," I wrote, as if the page could be a soapbox for restraint. Ledger. Entry 210. Sean's installation lauded, cedar aesthetic harvested by public. The most decisive moment came months later, not as a confrontation, but as an act of sheer domestic prudence. In late August, I organized a visit to the old house with the narrow purpose of collecting what remained of mine. A small stack of books, a sweater, and a lamp I had been fond of. I told no one I was going. Kem thought it a sensible task. He offered to come and held his hand like a shield at the last minute. Then, wisely, did not. The house sits in a part of town where the streets remember one another. Returning there felt less like entering a haunted property and more like stepping into a room where a previous life had done its best to move out with grace. The mantle's smudge was still there, stubborn and unrepentant. Sean was at a dinner across town, the neighbors told me later, but the rooms retained an echo of his presence. A glass half washed in the sink, a lamp set at a particular tilt. The cedar wreath they had left from months ago, now slightly faded, but still smelling like a small consecration. I moved through deliberately. I photographed the books I would take. My camera phone rendered nothing familiar. The images looked like the rooms, but with odd pockets where light would not settle. It makes for a strange record when your only proof tends to be the absence in frames. I went to the couch to fetch a sweater that had been folded under a cushion. When I reached my hand into the shadow, I paused and considered the ledger's ordinances. I could do this quick and be gone. Or I could do it with ceremony, taking the time to look at angles and mark what I had found. I chose ceremony, perhaps out of sentiment, or perhaps out of a stubborn hope that boundaries could be enforced through ritual. My hand brushed fabric. I lifted the sweater and folded it carefully, placing it into my tote as if nothing had happened. Then, because ritual had become a way of tethering me to reason, I moved a lamp a quarter turn for the ledger's sake. I set the cedar box, my cedar box that had once been a secret, on the mantel. Then I took one last look at the undercouch shadow. It was a habit now, a glance to see whether traces held. At the threshold, something pressed lightly against the side of my wrist, a coolness that traveled like a question. It was not a grabbing, nor a demand. It was a contact that registered and receded. I breathed and felt the old whirl of cedar in my nose like a punctuation. In that precise second, my hands felt full of decisions. I could return to the room and pull everything into a revealing, a public disclosure, the kind I had once fantasized about in darker moods. Or I could bring the lamp and the sweater and the cedar box with me, and walk without drama into the rest of my life. I chose the latter. I closed the door behind me with the practiced calm of someone who knows that evidence has value, but also that your life is not only its making public. Ledger. Entry 223. Final retrieval. Minor contact at threshold. Chose closure over spectacle. There are people for whom stakes mean broadcast. For me, stakes meant the ability to wake in the morning and make tea. When I left the house the final time, I put a simple tape over the keyhole and left a spare bulb in the sink. It is a small act of practical unreliability. No gesture of ownership, no attempt to win. I did not want the appendage to be given more culture by a press release. I merely wanted to stop being its neighbor. In the months after, the ledger became a record of repair, rather than only of proof. I wrote about lights replaced, about the thermos lids polished and kept in a pocket, about the rituals that snugged me into steadiness. I annotated with lists of people who might be called and when, with times to change the password on an account, with the date my mother planned to visit again. I did not imagine triumph. I imagined practice. Ledger. Entry 237. Repairing ordinary life. Small rituals as fortification. Sometimes the appendage made itself known in the places I thought we had domesticated. Once, in late October, as the city chilled and the bookshop lit a small fire for customers, someone left a cedar-scented soap at the counter with a note praising the shop's sense of curation. The soap's package was anonymous. It smelled loudly like the cedar that had been a private punctuation in my life. Mr. Kaplan winked at me when he set it beside the register. "Odd gifts," he said, folding his hands. I thought about it later and wrote the entry with a restrained hand. Ledger. Entry. 248. Anonymous cedar gift to bookshop. Possible echo of previous life. There continued to be nights when a coolness teased the soles of my feet, or when the lamp flickered into a precise tremor. There continued to be blank pockets in film chemistries and white smears on digital files. We adapted. Kem would call with new ideas. "Try a magnetometer," he suggested once, "or a gyroscope rigged to floorboards." And I would answer in kind. Yes, we can, eventually, or no, not tonight. Sometimes the technology revealed nothing except the patient absurdity of a phenomenon that was careful not to be captured. One spring evening, almost a year from the first entry in that original leather notebook, I sat with the ledger open and my thermos warm at my elbow. The bookshop bell chimed below, and a child let fall a laugh that sounded like a small bell. I wrote without hurry, and marked a page with a dot of ink where the season felt like a hinge between what had been and what might be. Ledger. Entry 263. 1 year, continued patterns. Adjustments made. Life inhabited with care. Occasionally, a curiosity would surface inside me that had nothing to do with vindication. I wanted to know if the appendage had any curiosity of its own, beyond responding to attention. I once, in a fit of scholarly tenderness, left a small folded note under the couch, where I had first felt the marble cool fingertip. A piece of paper that said, in neat handwriting, "Who are you when no one watches?" I left it not because I expected an answer, but because I was testing the grammar of attention in a humble human way. When I returned the next day, the note was gone. That absence could be interpreted many ways. Taken by a visitor, moved by a cleaning hand, or removed by the appendage itself. I wrote the removal down as a fact and left it at that. Ledger. Entry. 276. Note under couch removed. Unknown agent of removal. Months turned. Discreet and relentless. I learned the pleasure of small projects. Rehanging a crooked print, learning to mend a hem, baking a loaf that would stay present in the apartment like a domestic monument. The ledger functioned as companion and a slow teacher. My entries registered not only anomalies, but the scaffolding I had built against them. Friends who called, lists of spare keys, a small tube of glue I liked for mending bindings. Life as a practice is what I called it. Attention applied to survival and to modest flourishing. Then, one evening in late summer that followed a hot day, I received a postcard in the mail. It was a glossy reproduction of a photograph from an old press release, a scene from one of Sean's installations. Lamps hung like constellations, strips of wood and glass. On the back, in careful, almost affectionate lettering, someone had written, "Thinking of you in the light." The address was mine, but the handwriting offered no signature. The postcard made my chest tighten in a way that was not purely fear. It was recognition, a private signal that my earlier life still reached into my present. I took it to the ledger, smoothed it against the page, and registered the event. Ledger. Entry 291. Postcard. Image from Sean's installation. Unsigned note. Thinking of you in the light. My response to it was simple. I did not write back. I did not call. I placed the postcard inside the cedar box and shut the lid. It is worth noting that the ledger keeps track of small refusals as carefully as it does records of strange contact. Saying nothing is itself a choice, and my ledger contained a long list of such choices. As the seasons shifted again, the bookshop found a rhythm, and I found a friend in Mr. Kaplan who would, without ceremony, bring me soup when he heard I had been late cross-referencing donated volumes. Kem remained a friend with practical hands and occasional theories that he wanted to test over pizza. My mother called every few days with questions that were mostly about whether I had eaten and whether the ledger was in a safe place. I lived quietly and deliberately. The cedar sat like a watermark on every page of my life. It was both memory and a marker. It told me where I had been and how the presence had chosen to appear. People sometimes asked about the ledger, curious when I mentioned it in passing. I would say, "It is my way of attending." That was true, and also a small political position. There are some things that do not need to be given to the public domain. Ledger. Entry. 308. Quiet life stabilized. Friends help. Mother persistent. Ledger a practice of attention. There were, inevitably, moments of temptation to open the cedar box to someone I trusted. Kem, at one point, asked, respectfully, if he could see the film again. "Not for spectacle," he said. "Just to satisfy a scientist's curiosity." I hesitated. Sharing is a kind of exposure. Yet there is a profound difference between testing with a friend and testing for an audience. I brought him to the bookshop one wet evening, and we spread the film strips on Mr. Kaplan's counter. Light from the shop's lamp, making the grains visible like timepieces. Kem and I peered together and whispered technicalities. He pointed out a recurring texture in the white smears that suggested a kind of particulate interaction, but he would not name it. He respected my hesitation. "We'll keep it quiet," he said. "We won't publish. We'll continue the tests." It was a courteous promise. We kept it. The ledger marked the meeting and the brevity of our conclusion. Ledger. Entry 321. Shared film with Kem privately. No public action. Continued testing with restraint. Every so often I would find traces beyond what we had catalogued. An extra cedar shaving tucked into the pages of a donated book. A tiny scrap of fabric that didn't belong to any of us placed upon the shopkeeper's counter. Those small interventions struck me as if someone were leaving bookmarks in my life. I did not know whether they were gestures of malice, of curiosity, or of something else entirely. I accepted ambiguity as the default epistemology of the phenomenon. Once, on an afternoon when the shop was slow and the rain had that precise cadence that encourages reading aloud, I left the ledger open on the nightstand with the pen poised. I wrote a line, and then a second, and then a third. I was not thinking of proving anything. I was thinking of the arc of the months, and how a person learns to live with an unnameable presence among their things. Ledger. Entry 333. Ambiguity accepted as modus vivendi. Small traces continue. Life's course adjusted to accommodate unknown. The last entry in this book is less dramatic than some of the moments I had once imagined as necessary endpoints. There was no dramatic revelation, no court case, no viral video that collapsed the house into a frenzy. There was instead a kind of thinning, a quiet exodus of the appendage's insistence as the public culture absorbed its favorite motifs and moved on. Sean continued his life in public, applauded and photographed. The city adopted the cedar as aesthetic shorthand. The appendage, whatever its agency, seemed to respond less often, as if the grammar of attention had shifted, and the world had become noisier, less available. On an evening when the bookshop's window held the lambent gold of a street lamp and a customer below left a copy of a poem on the counter for me, I wrote the final lines in the leather book. The cedar box sat beside me, its scent softened by seasons. I inhaled it and felt the ledger's weight like a small, steadied heart. Ledger. Entry 349. The world moves on. Public life absorbs cedar motifs. Presence recedes into less frequent contact. Life practiced and repaired. There is a temptation in endings to make them larger than life. I will not indulge that. I chose the path of measured living. I chose to preserve dignity and the small freedoms a person needs: a private bed, a thermos that fits the palm, a ledger that keeps the logic of a life. I accepted that some truths, if truth is the right word here, remain in private archives, and that sometimes leaving is the most courageous act you can do. The last line I wrote in that book was the sentence I had learned to carry like a pocketed truth. It was simple and not triumphant. It read the way I had learned to speak at the end of long process. Precise, quiet, and true to the ledger's grammar. Ledger. Entry 350. He chose pleasure over reality. He wasn't human. I set the pen down and closed the leather cover like finishing a sentence. The book felt heavier when closed and yet lighter in my hands for having been full. The cedar smell stood like a watermark on my fingers. I put the ledger into the cedar box and slid the lid closed. I did not need anyone to peer into the box to believe what I had recorded. The record was for me to carry. Outside, the bookshop's bell chimed and a rain-wet customer entered to ask for recommendations. Inside, the world continued with its ordinary hunger for days. I walked to the small window, watched the street's light tilt on returning puddles, and held the thermos warm between my palms. If you have lingered with this, there is one gentle thing I will ask. Subscribe for more quiet tales that linger.